September 23rd, 1997. 6:30 in the morning. Federal Plaza, Manhattan. The city was just waking up when federal agents carried out a large drug operation that had been building for years. 14 men were taken into custody in what authorities described as a major heroin distribution network, moving large quantities of narcotics into New York City. Among those arrested that morning was a 63-year-old man named John Campopiano. When he stood before the judge later that day, he calmly asked for his heart medication. To reporters, he was known as Johnny Echo. To movie fans, he was remembered as Jimmy Two Times. Most people only knew him from a brief scene in the 1990 crime film Goodfellas. In that movie, a small character walks into the Bamboo Lounge and says, "I'm gonna go get the papers, get the papers." The line lasts only seconds. It became one of the most quoted moments in the film. People laughed. They repeated it at parties. It turned into a pop culture catchphrase. But the real man behind that line had a long and complicated past, and it was nothing like a joke. John Campopiano was born on August 13, 1934, in East Harlem, New York. Not just anywhere in East Harlem, but on Pleasant Avenue, a tight stretch of blocks between 114th and 120th Street. In the mid-20th century, that area was the center of Italian Harlem. It was a neighborhood built on family ties, old traditions, and unspoken rules. If you didn't grow up there, you didn't fully understand it. Pleasant Avenue operated differently from the rest of Manhattan. Respect mattered more than money. Silence mattered more than talk. Loyalty mattered more than everything. John's father, Michel Campopiano, owned properties in Little Italy. He had legitimate businesses and real estate holdings that gave the family financial stability. The Campopiano name carried weight in certain circles. It meant connections. It meant opportunity. It also meant you didn't ask unnecessary questions. John grew up observing all of this. He learned early how things worked. He understood who held influence and who followed orders. He saw how business was conducted quietly and how disputes were handled without outsiders getting involved. He also had something that made him stand out. John had a speech pattern that caused him to repeat certain words or phrases twice. It wasn't a performance. It wasn't meant to be funny. It was simply how he spoke. Friends and family were used to it. No one laughed about it on Pleasant Avenue. It was just part of who he was. Years later, that habit would become the only thing many people remembered about him. As John entered adulthood in the 1950s and 1960s, New York's underworld was changing. The heroin trade was growing rapidly. Large shipments were coming into the United States through international pipelines. East Harlem became one of the central distribution points. Then, in the early 1970s, federal authorities dismantled what was known as the French Connection, a major heroin smuggling route linking Turkey, France, and New York. High-ranking figures were arrested. Long-standing operations were disrupted. Whenever power structures collapse, someone steps in to fill the gap. In East Harlem, a younger and more aggressive generation emerged. They were determined to take advantage of the vacuum. Some of these men would later be associated with what became known as the East Harlem Purple Gang, a group tied closely to larger organized crime families, but operating with its own identity. John was not a flashy leader. He wasn't a headline figure. He didn't seek attention, but he was part of the environment. He knew the players. He understood the streets. While others focused on control and enforcement, John focused on distribution. He worked as a middleman, connecting suppliers to lower-level dealers. He moved product steadily and quietly. He didn't attract attention. He didn't show off wealth. He didn't try to become famous. That low profile became his advantage. In that world, visibility could be dangerous. The louder you were, the more likely you were to attract law enforcement or rivals. John avoided both whenever possible. He had early run-ins with the law related to narcotics. He served time, then he returned to the same environment. For many men raised on Pleasant Avenue, leaving that life wasn't simple. It wasn't just about money. It was about identity, relationships, and the only system they truly understood. Through the 1970s and 1980s, Pleasant Avenue gained a reputation among law enforcement as a serious heroin distribution hub. The money moving through those few blocks was enormous. While some individuals grew rich and flamboyant, John remained steady and quiet. By the time Martin Scorsese began adapting Henry Hill's story for Goodfellas, John had already spent decades operating behind the scenes. Henry Hill, a former associate connected to the Lucchese family, had known John personally. He had heard him speak. He had spent time in the same social clubs. When he shared his stories for the book that inspired the film, he mentioned John's speech habit. Scorsese saw something memorable in that detail. On screen, actor Anthony Powers portrayed Jimmy 2 times in a short but unforgettable moment. The audience laughed. The line stuck. But the film didn't explore the real history. It didn't show the years of heroin distribution. It didn't show the arrests. It didn't show Pleasant Avenue's transformation into one of the busiest drug corridors in New York City. Instead, it gave viewers a quick moment of humor. Meanwhile, in real life, John Campopiano continued operating in the background, aging, adapting, surviving. Until that September morning in 1997, when federal agents finally knocked on his door. To most of America, Jimmy 2 times was just a funny character. But behind that brief scene stood a man who had spent decades navigating one of the most dangerous underground economies in New York City, quietly, steadily, and without ever becoming the headline. And that was only the beginning of the real story.
By the mid-1970s, Pleasant Avenue had become more than just a neighborhood in East Harlem. To law enforcement, it was a major distribution zone. To those involved in the trade, it was a marketplace operating in plain sight. Small apartment buildings lined the streets, social clubs stayed open late, men gathered at corner cafes, talking quietly, watching who came and went. On the surface, it looked like any tight-knit community. Underneath, it was something very different. After the fall of the French Connection in the early 1970s, the heroin supply routes shifted. The old system had been disrupted by federal crackdowns, but demand had not disappeared. Instead, new networks formed. Pleasant Avenue became one of the key points where wholesale quantities were handled before being pushed out to other parts of New York City. John Campopiano fit into this system as a steady operator. He was not the boss. He wasn't the public face. He didn't make loud moves. He worked as a connector, someone who received packages from suppliers and passed them along to lower-level distributors. His job required reliability, discretion, and strong relationships. That was his value. At the time, a kilogram of heroin could move for around $75,000 at the wholesale level. Once broken down and sold in smaller quantities on the street, the value could multiply several times. Multiply that by several kilograms a month, and the money flowing through just a few city blocks was staggering. Pleasant Avenue became known inside law enforcement circles as a serious drug corridor. Investigators tracked meetings, watched known associates, and built cases slowly. But proving involvement was difficult. The system was layered. Middlemen rarely handled large quantities directly in visible ways. Transactions were often separated, coded, and routed through trusted individuals. John understood how to stay within those layers. He avoided flashy displays of wealth. No expensive cars, no designer suits, no public nightlife investments. He didn't try to appear powerful. In that world, staying quiet was often safer than looking successful. Meanwhile, East Harlem was experiencing rising tension. A younger group of Italian-American men, later referred to as the East Harlem Purple Gang, began gaining influence during the power shifts of the 1970s. They were closely connected to established organized crime families, but operated with a new level of intensity. Violence increased during that era. Rivalries formed, disputes escalated. Law enforcement pressure intensified as homicides and disappearances drew attention. John was not known as an enforcer or a public figure in those conflicts. His role stayed centered around distribution. While others focused on territory and power, he focused on product movement. And the product kept moving. Through the late 1970s and into the 1980s, authorities increased surveillance in East Harlem. Task forces were formed. Long investigations targeted long-standing networks. Arrests were made. Some independent groups were absorbed into larger organized crime structures. The Purple Gang, as an independent name, eventually faded. Some members joined official crews within larger families. The structure shifted, but the heroin trade did not disappear. John continued working. He was now older, in his 50s, then his 60s, but still connected, still active, still careful. Around this time, another story was beginning to take shape. Henry Hill, who had once been deeply involved with the Lucchese family, began sharing his experiences with author Nicholas Pileggi. Hill had first-hand knowledge of the Bamboo Lounge, Pleasant Avenue, and many of the individuals connected to those circles. When Hill's life story became the book Wise Guy, and later the film Goodfellas, certain characters were highlighted. Some were expanded, some were dramatized, and some were reduced to a single moment. John Campapiano became Jimmy 2 times. On screen, the character appears briefly. Actor Anthony Powers walks into the Bamboo Lounge, repeats a line twice, and exits. The audience laughs. The moment sticks. But what the film did not show was that the real man had decades of involvement in a high-stakes underground business. It did not show Pleasant Avenue's transformation into a wholesale drug hub. It did not show the layered system that allowed distribution to continue even after major crackdowns. Movies simplify. Real life rarely does. While the film gained popularity in the early 1990s, John remained active in the real world. He did not seek publicity. He did not attempt to correct the portrayal. He did not tell his side of the story. He continued operating quietly. Then came 1997. Federal investigators had been building a case involving an older network of individuals still involved in heroin distribution. Surveillance, informants, and financial tracking had created enough evidence to move forward. On September 23, 1997, agents executed coordinated arrests across the city. 14 men were taken into custody. Among them was John Campapiano. Court records from that era provide limited public detail about his exact responsibilities within that particular case. Prosecutors described the group as long-term distributors who had continued operating despite years of prior enforcement pressure. What stood out most was not his age, but his persistence. Many men from that era had been imprisoned, disappeared, or left the life behind. John was still present. After the arrest, bail hearings followed. Some defendants were released pending trial, others were held longer. Like many federal drug cases from that time, final outcomes were resolved through plea agreements or sealed arrangements that remained difficult to access publicly. What is known is this: John Campapiano eventually returned to private life. He did not become a public figure. He did not grant interviews. He did not attempt to use the movie's fame for attention. He faded back into the background. And in many ways, that may have been his greatest achievement. In a world where visibility often led to prison or worse, He remained steady and quiet for decades. The film had turned him into a brief punchline, but in reality, he had been part of a complex distribution system that operated for nearly 30 years through crackdowns, internal conflicts, and generational shifts. While audiences repeated a funny movie line, the real John Campopiano had built a life based on caution, silence, and survival. And his story was not over yet.
When Goodfellas was released in 1990, it changed how many people viewed organized crime in America. The film was intense, stylish, and unforgettable. It turned real-life figures into cultural icons. Some became symbols of power, others became symbols of chaos, and one became a punchline. For most viewers, Jimmy Two Times was just a quick laugh, a man who repeated himself and disappeared from the screen almost as quickly as he arrived. It was a short moment, but it stuck. People quoted the line for decades. What they didn't know was that the real man behind that character had already spent over 30 years navigating one of the most dangerous underground economies in New York City. Hollywood made a choice. Director Martin Scorsese focused on what would entertain audiences. The speech habit was memorable. It added personality to the world of the film. It made viewers laugh in the middle of a tense story. But films are built on decisions: what to show, what to leave out, what to simplify. In John Campopiano's case, the film showed the quirk and left out everything else. It did not show Pleasant Avenue becoming a wholesale heroin corridor during the 1970s. It did not show the federal crackdowns that reshaped East Harlem. It did not show the years of arrests, returns, and quiet persistence. It did not show how someone could survive in that environment for decades without becoming a headline. While others from that era met dramatic ends, John lived a very different outcome. The real-life inspiration for Tommy DeVito did not die peacefully. The real-life inspiration for Jimmy Conway spent his final years in prison. Henry Hill entered witness protection and later struggled financially and personally. But John Campopiano lived until the age of 84. He passed away quietly in Putnam County, far from East Harlem and far from the streets that shaped his early life. That fact alone is remarkable. The world he grew up in was filled with risk. Federal investigations lasted years. Internal rivalries could turn quickly. The drug trade brought constant attention from law enforcement. Yet he managed to avoid long-term imprisonment late in life. He avoided public spotlight. He avoided the violent endings that took many others. How? Maybe it was discipline. Maybe it was luck. Maybe it was knowing when to speak and when to stay silent. There is also something else to consider. His speech pattern, the very trait that made him famous in the movie, may have worked in his favor. Repeating words might have made him seem harmless or unimportant to outsiders. It might have caused people to underestimate him. In an environment where perception mattered, appearing non-threatening could be useful. Or maybe it meant nothing at all. Maybe he was simply a steady operator who understood his role and never tried to exceed it. What is clear is this: John did not chase fame. He did not try to profit from the movie. He did not appear on talk